I was a nanny falsely accused of abuse, and the moment Detective Morrison slid that arrest warrant across the coffee table, I knew my life as I understood it was over. The paper felt heavier than it should have, the black ink spelling out my name beneath words like child endangerment and assault of a minor. 3-year-old Emma sat in the corner of the living room, her tiny fingers wrapped around a stuffed rabbit, watching me with those wide green eyes that had once lit up every time I walked through the door. The accusations came from Emma's mother, Victoria Henley, who stood behind the detective with her arms crossed, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her designer blazer. Her face wore the mask of a concerned parent, but I caught the flash of something else in her eyes. Relief. As if she'd been waiting for this moment, preparing for it. The bruises on Emma's arms had appeared 2 weeks ago. Small, finger-shaped marks that made my stomach turn when I first noticed them during bath time. I'd documented everything, taken photos, called the pediatrician immediately. But somehow, in the twisted logic of this investigation, my vigilance had become evidence of guilt. Detective Morrison's voice carried the weight of certainty as he explained the charges, physical evidence, witness statements, a pattern of behavior that painted me as someone who had violated the most sacred trust, the protection of a child. But I knew something he didn't. I knew that the real monster was standing 3 feet away from him, playing the role of grieving mother with Oscar-worthy precision. Victoria's performance was flawless. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her voice breaking at just the right moments as she described finding the bruises, Emma's fearful behavior, the way her daughter flinched when I reached for her. Every word was calculated, every gesture rehearsed. She'd been planning this for months. The handcuffs clicked around my wrists with a sound that echoed through the pristine living room. Emma's rabbit fell to the floor as she watched me being led away, her small voice calling my name in confusion. The sound followed me down the hallway, through the front door, and into the back of the police car. It would haunt me for the next 6 months. Prison was a masterclass in patience. The other inmates learned quickly that I wasn't someone to be tested, but it wasn't physical intimidation that kept them at bay. It was the way I carried myself, the methodical precision with which I approached every day. While they saw imprisonment, I saw opportunity. Time to think. Time to plan. Time to understand exactly how Victoria had orchestrated my destruction. The charges were eventually dropped. Not because the system worked, but because Victoria had grown sloppy in her confidence. A neighbor's security camera had captured footage of her grabbing Emma roughly by the arm on the same day the bruises appeared. The timestamp didn't lie, and neither did the DNA evidence found under Emma's fingernails, skin cells that belonged to her mother, not me. But vindication felt hollow when I learned what had really been happening. Victoria had been abusing Emma for months, using me as the perfect scapegoat. A nanny with no family, no powerful connections, no one who would ask too many questions when I disappeared into the system. She'd been documenting every interaction, building a case against me while covering her own tracks with the expertise of someone who had planned this from the beginning. The real revelation came through Emma's medical records, which I gained access to through a sympathetic social worker who'd grown suspicious of Victoria's story. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Emergency room visits for accidents. That coincided with my days off. Behavioral changes that Victoria had attributed to my increasingly aggressive demeanor. A psychological profile that she'd paid a private psychologist to create, painting me as someone with anger management issues and a history of violence, all fabricated. Victoria had been methodical, but she'd underestimated my capacity for patience, and she'd made one critical error. She assumed that destroying my life would be enough to satisfy her need for control. She didn't realize that her actions had created something far more dangerous than a disgraced nanny. They'd created someone with nothing left to lose and all the time in the world to plan her destruction. The first phase of my revenge was information gathering. Victoria's life was an open book to anyone who knew how to read it. Social media posts revealed her routines, her relationships, her insecurities. Tax records showed the financial pressure she'd been under. Her late husband's life insurance money was running out, and she'd been using Emma's trust fund to maintain her lifestyle. The abuse had been a symptom of her desperation, and framing me had been her solution to avoid scrutiny. But what made Victoria truly vulnerable was her pride. She'd built her entire identity around being the perfect mother, the tragic widow who'd overcome adversity. She couldn't resist the spotlight, the sympathy, the way people looked at her with admiration for her strength. in the face of such betrayal by someone she'd trusted with her child. I began attending the same coffee shop where Victoria held court with her circle of suburban friends. I would sit 3 tables away, laptop open, headphones in, invisible in plain sight. I watched her perform her daily routine of victimhood, describing how she'd bravely uncovered my true nature and saved her daughter from further harm. Her friends hung on every word, their faces a mixture of horror and fascination. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria had destroyed my reputation through storytelling, and I would destroy hers the same way. But where she had used lies, I would use truth. Where she had been sloppy, I would be precise. Where she had been cruel, I would be merciless. The coffee shop observations revealed something useful. Victoria's need for external validation had made her careless about operational security. She used the same password for everything, a combination of Emma's birth date and her late husband's name. I watched her type it into her phone, her laptop, even the tablet she used to show photos to her friends. Pattern recognition was one of my strengths. It's what had made me good at my job, understanding the subtle cues that indicated what a child needed. Now I would use that same skill to understand what Victoria needed, the complete destruction of everything she'd built her identity around. The breakthrough came when I gained access to her email account. Not through hacking, I wasn't skilled enough for that, but through the reset function on her laptop while she was in the bathroom during one of her coffee shop performances. Her entire digital life spread out before me like a map of her weaknesses. The emails painted a picture of a woman spiraling out of control. Desperate messages to lawyers about accessing Emma's trust fund, increasingly frantic communications with her therapist about managing stress and maintaining appearances. Most damning of all, a series of exchanges with a private investigator she'd hired to dig up dirt on me, complete with instructions to create a compelling narrative if no real evidence could be found. But the crown jewel was a voice memo she'd sent to herself, a psychological exercise her therapist had suggested for managing guilt. In it, she described the exact moment she'd lost control and grabbed Emma, the panic she'd felt seeing the bruises, the calculated decision to blame me. It was a full confession, recorded in her own voice, timestamp and all. The evidence was damning, but evidence alone wouldn't satisfy the depth of rage that had been building inside me for months. Victoria had stolen 6 months of my life, destroyed my career, and traumatized a child I'd grown to love. She deserved more than prison. She deserved to experience the same helplessness, the same public humiliation, the same systematic destruction of everything she held dear. I spent weeks studying her vulnerabilities, mapping her relationships, understanding the ecosystem of reputation and social standing that she'd built her life around. Victoria's power came from her image, her network, her ability to control narratives. She was about to learn what happened when someone better at patterns took control of that narrative. The first crack in her facade came at Emma's preschool. I'd maintained a relationship with several of the teachers who'd known me before the accusations, women who'd never quite believed Victoria's story, but had been powerless to challenge it. Through them, I learned about the parent meeting where Victoria would be discussing child safety and sharing her experience with dangerous caregivers. I arrived early, taking a seat in the back row where I could observe without being immediately noticed. The other parents filled the room with the typical energy of suburban gatherings, concerned, gossipy, eager for drama that didn't directly affect their lives. Victoria stood at the front, her presentation materials spread across the table, her confidence radiating through the room like heat from a furnace. She began her presentation with practiced ease, describing the warning signs that parents should watch for, the importance of background checks, the way predators could hide behind caring facades. Her voice carried the weight of personal experience, the authenticity that came from having lived through such a nightmare. But I'd prepared for this moment. Hidden in the back of the room, I had my laptop open, connected to the school's Wi-Fi, ready to broadcast the voice memo I'd found in her email. The timing had to be perfect, a moment when her presentation reached its emotional peak, when she was most vulnerable to the kind of devastating revelation that would shatter her carefully constructed narrative. Victoria reached the climax of her presentation, describing the moment she'd discovered the truth about her trusted nanny. Her voice broke with manufactured emotion, her hand trembling as she dabbed at her eyes. The audience was completely captivated, hanging on every word of her performance. That's when I activated the audio file. Victoria's own voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable, describing her moment of violence against Emma, her decision to frame me, her satisfaction at having found the perfect scapegoat. The confession played for 30 seconds before she realized what was happening and rushed to the laptop, but it was too late. The silence that followed was deafening. 50 parents stared at Victoria with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to betrayal. She stood frozen at the front of the room, her mouth opening and closing without sound, her perfect facade cracking like ice under pressure. I stood up from my seat in the back row, my movement drawing every eye in the room. Victoria's face went white when she saw me, understanding flooding her features along with the realization that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. The room erupted in whispers, accusations, demands for explanation. Victoria tried to speak, to explain, to somehow salvage the situation, but her words were lost in the chaos. Parents were pulling out their phones, recording, texting, spreading the news through their networks with the speed of digital wildfire. I walked calmly to the front of the room, my footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet that fell as I approached Victoria. She backed away from me, her eyes wide with something that might have been fear or might have been recognition, the understanding that she was now the prey instead of the predator. The principal demanded order, threatening to call security, but the damage was done. Victoria's reputation lay in ruins around her feet, and everyone in that room knew they'd witnessed the public destruction of someone who'd built her life on lies. But this was just the beginning. The school presentation had been a tactical strike, designed to crack her public image and create vulnerability. The real revenge would be longer, more systematic, more devastating. I had months of planning ahead of me, and Victoria had no idea what was coming. Over the following weeks, I watched her world contract. The story spread through the community like an infection, carried by social media and neighborhood gossip. Victoria's friends stopped returning her calls. The charity organizations she'd volunteered with quietly removed her from their boards. Even her yoga studio began scheduling her classes at inconvenient times, hoping she'd take the hint and leave. But Victoria was resilient in her desperation. She hired a crisis management consultant, began crafting a narrative about mental health struggles and postpartum depression. She positioned herself as a victim of her own trauma, someone who'd made mistakes but deserved compassion and forgiveness. The consultant's strategy was predictable: acknowledge the mistakes, express deep remorse, seek professional help, and gradually rebuild trust through consistent positive actions. It was a textbook rehabilitation campaign, and under normal circumstances, it might have worked. Victoria had the resources, the social connections, and the community sympathy that came with being a widow and single mother. But she was no longer operating under normal circumstances. She was operating under my circumstances, and I had advantages that her consultant couldn't account for. I had patience, precision, and most importantly, I had the truth. The consultant's first mistake was underestimating the depth of Victoria's deception. He assumed the voice memo was an isolated incident, a moment of weakness rather than a pattern of behavior. He didn't have access to the emails, the financial records, the complete picture of someone who'd been systematically abusing her child and manipulating the system to cover it up. His second mistake was not understanding who he was really fighting. Victoria had told him about the disgruntled nanny, who was trying to destroy her reputation, but she'd painted me as unstable, obsessed, someone whose accusations could be dismissed as the ravings of a convicted criminal. She didn't tell him that the charges against me had been dropped, that DNA evidence had proven my innocence, that I was operating from a position of legal and moral authority. The consultant's campaign began with a series of carefully orchestrated public appearances. Victoria would attend community events, volunteer at local charities, demonstrate through her actions that she was someone who deserved a second chance. The strategy was to rebuild her image slowly, one positive interaction at a time. I attended these events as well, always staying in the background, observing, documenting. I watched Victoria work the room at a charity auction, her smile bright but strained, her movements careful and calculated. She was performing again, but this time the audience was skeptical. People were polite but distant, their interactions carrying the weight of unspoken judgment. The auction was for a children's hospital, an ironic choice given Victoria's history. She'd volunteered to help with event planning, probably hoping that associating herself with child welfare would help rehabilitate her image. Instead, her presence made everyone uncomfortable, a reminder of the accusations that had destroyed her credibility. I watched her approach potential donors, her practiced charm falling flat against their polite but firm rejections. She was experiencing something she'd never encountered before: the loss of social power, the inability to control how others perceived her. It was a preview of what was coming, but she didn't understand that yet. The real breakthrough came when I made contact with Victoria's former therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen. The woman who'd been treating Victoria for anxiety and depression had begun to suspect that her patient was not entirely truthful about her circumstances. The voice memo had been Dr. Chen's idea, a technique for helping patients confront their guilt and take responsibility for their actions. Dr. Chen couldn't share confidential information about Victoria's treatment, but she could discuss general principles of therapy and the importance of honesty in the therapeutic relationship. She could also acknowledge that she'd terminated her professional relationship with Victoria after concerns arose about the patient's credibility. This termination was significant because Victoria had been using Dr. Chen's treatment as evidence of her commitment to change. Her crisis management consultant had built the entire rehabilitation strategy around the idea that Victoria was actively working with a mental health professional to address her issues. Without Dr. Chen's support, that narrative collapsed. But more importantly, Dr. Chen's termination created a paper trail. Professional terminations required documentation, and that documentation would be discoverable in any future legal proceedings. Victoria's consultant didn't realize that his client's foundation was built on sand, and every public appearance was creating more evidence of her continued deception. The consultant's third mistake was not understanding the legal implications of Victoria's attempted rehabilitation. By publicly positioning herself as someone who'd made mistakes but was working to change, Victoria was essentially admitting guilt while trying to minimize consequences. Every interview, every public appearance, every carefully crafted statement was creating a record that could be used against her. I began documenting everything, creating a comprehensive file of Victoria's inconsistencies and contradictions. When she claimed in one interview that the abuse was a single incident born of stress, I had emails showing months of concerning behavior. When she suggested that her actions were the result of untreated mental health issues, I had therapy records showing that she'd been receiving treatment and had explicitly chosen to hide her behavior from her therapist. The picture that emerged was of someone who'd been systematically abusing her child, methodically framing an innocent person, and now cynically manipulating public sympathy to avoid consequences. It was a level of calculation and cruelty that went beyond simple desperation into the realm of genuine evil. But the most damning evidence was still Emma herself. The child was now in the custody of Victoria's sister, a woman who'd initially supported Victoria but had grown increasingly concerned about her niece's well-being. Through careful observation and documentation, I could see the signs of trauma that Victoria's abuse had caused, signs that contradicted her claims of being a loving mother who'd made a single mistake. Emma's behavioral changes were documented in daycare reports, pediatric visits, and therapy sessions. The pattern was consistent with long-term abuse, not a single incident. Victoria's sister had shared some of these concerns with Child Protective Services, creating another official record that contradicted Victoria's public narrative. The consultant's campaign was failing, but Victoria refused to accept defeat. She doubled down on her strategy, becoming more aggressive in her public appearances, more insistent in her claims of redemption. She began attacking her critics, suggesting that they were motivated by jealousy or misinformation. She even hinted that I was orchestrating a campaign against her, positioning herself as the victim of a vindictive ex-employee. This was exactly what I'd been waiting for. Victoria's desperation was making her sloppy, and her attacks on me gave me the opening I needed to shift from passive observation to active engagement. She'd made this personal, and now I could respond in kind. I began reaching out to journalists, offering to share my story about being falsely accused and the evidence I'd gathered about Victoria's true nature. The story was compelling: an innocent woman destroyed by false accusations, the real abuser hiding behind privilege and manipulation, the systematic corruption of justice that had nearly destroyed an innocent life. The first journalist I contacted was Sarah Martinez, an investigative reporter who specialized in child welfare cases. Sarah had been following Victoria's attempted rehabilitation with professional skepticism, sensing that there was more to the story than Victoria was willing to admit. When I reached out with documented evidence of Victoria's pattern of deception, Sarah saw an opportunity for the kind of comprehensive investigation that could expose the truth. Sarah's investigation was thorough and methodical. She interviewed former colleagues, obtained court records, spoke with law enforcement officials who'd worked the case. She traced the timeline of Victoria's accusations against me, documenting the inconsistencies and contradictions that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. Most importantly, Sarah had access to resources that I didn't. She could compel officials to speak on the record, obtain documents through Freedom of Information requests, and provide the kind of credible platform that would make people listen. When Sarah's investigation was published, it would carry the weight of professional journalism rather than the accusations of a disgruntled nanny. The article was devastating. Sarah had uncovered evidence that went beyond even what I'd discovered. Financial records showed that Victoria had been stealing from Emma's trust fund to pay for her lifestyle. Medical records revealed a pattern of suspicious injuries that predated my employment. Most damning of all, Sarah had obtained recordings of Victoria's interviews with police, in which she'd contradicted her own timeline and provided details that didn't match the physical evidence. But the article also told my story. It described the months I'd spent in prison, the destruction of my career, the trauma of being falsely accused of harming a child I'd loved. It painted a picture of someone who'd been systematically destroyed by lies, someone who'd lost everything because of another person's cruelty and desperation. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Victoria's remaining supporters abandoned her, her crisis management consultant resigned, and law enforcement began reviewing the original investigation. The district attorney's office announced that they were considering charges against Victoria for filing false reports and child abuse. Victoria's response was predictable. She hired a new lawyer, denied the allegations, and claimed that the article was a hit piece orchestrated by her enemies. She positioned herself as the victim of a media conspiracy, someone who was being destroyed by people who couldn't accept that she was trying to change. But her denials fell on deaf ears. The evidence was too comprehensive, too well documented, too damning. Victoria had built her rehabilitation on lies, and now those lies were collapsing under the weight of truth. The legal system moved slowly, but it moved. Victoria was arrested on charges of child abuse, filing false reports, and perjury. The evidence against her was overwhelming. DNA results, medical records, her own voice memo, and a paper trail that documented months of deception. But the real punishment wasn't the legal proceedings. It was the complete destruction of everything Victoria had built her identity around. She'd lost her social standing, her friends, her reputation, her freedom, and most importantly, her daughter. Emma was now in protective custody, safe from the person who'd been harming her while blaming others. Victoria's trial was a media sensation, with every sordid detail of her deception exposed to public scrutiny. The prosecution presented a comprehensive and persuasive case, showing how Victoria had participated in a pattern of harmful conduct toward minors, while simultaneously attempting to falsely accuse an innocent person of her alleged actions. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Victoria was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. More importantly, she was permanently stripped of custody rights, ensuring that Emma would never again be subjected to her mother's abuse. But even imprisonment wasn't enough to satisfy the depth of what Victoria had done. She'd destroyed my life, traumatized a child, and corrupted the justice system through her lies. The legal system could punish her crimes, but it couldn't restore what she'd taken from me. That's when I realized that true revenge wasn't about punishment. It was about transformation. Victoria had tried to destroy me, but instead she'd created something stronger. She'd forced me to develop skills I'd never known I possessed, to understand systems I'd never had to navigate, to become someone who could fight back against injustice. The woman who'd been falsely accused of abuse was gone, replaced by someone who understood how to gather evidence, build cases, and expose truth. Victoria had created her own nemesis, and in doing so had ensured her own destruction. I began working with other families who'd been affected by false accusations, helping them navigate the legal system and defend themselves against lies. I used the skills I'd developed during my own ordeal to help others who were facing similar situations. Victoria's attempt to destroy me had instead created someone who could protect others from people like her. The final chapter of my revenge came when Victoria was released from prison after serving 8 years of her sentence. She'd lost everything: her home, her money, her reputation, her daughter. She was a middle-aged woman with a criminal record, no marketable skills, and no support system. I was waiting for her outside the prison gates, not with anger or threats, but with a simple message. I handed her a newspaper clipping about the non-profit organization I'd founded to help families affected by false accusations. The article mentioned that we'd helped over 300 families clear their names and protect their children from real abusers. Victoria looked at the article, then at me, and I saw the moment she understood. Her attempt to destroy me had instead created something that would help others for generations to come. She'd tried to break me, but I'd used the pieces to build something stronger. I walked away without saying a word, leaving Victoria standing alone outside the prison gates with nothing but the knowledge that her cruelty had been transformed into something good. She'd spent 8 years in prison, but she would spend the rest of her life knowing that her victim had become a force for justice. The DNA evidence that had finally proved my innocence was now being used to help other families find truth. The investigative skills I'd developed while planning my revenge were being used to expose real abusers and protect innocent children. The patience I'd learned in prison was being used to help others navigate their own ordeals. Victoria had tried to write the story of my destruction, but I'd taken control of the narrative and written a different ending. She'd created a monster, but instead of destroying others, I'd learned to destroy the systems that allowed people like her to thrive. That was my revenge. Not just punishment, but transformation. Not just justice, but the creation of something that would prevent others from experiencing what I'd endured. Victoria had tried to end my story, but instead she'd given me the beginning of a new one. Emma was now 18, a strong young woman who'd overcome the trauma of her early childhood. She'd reached out to me on her birthday, thanking me for the role I'd played in exposing the truth and protecting her from further abuse. She was studying child psychology, planning to dedicate her life to helping other children who'd been hurt by the people who should have protected them. In trying to destroy me, Victoria had created not just one person dedicated to justice, but two. Her legacy would be the opposite of what she'd intended. Instead of getting away with abuse, she'd created a generation of people committed to preventing others from experiencing what we'd endured. I stood in my office looking at the wall covered with thank you letters from families we'd helped, newspaper clippings about cases we'd won, and photos of children who were now safe because we'd exposed the truth about their abusers. This was what victory looked like. Not the destruction of an enemy, but the creation of something that would outlast us all. Victoria had tried to write my ending, but I'd written hers instead. And in the process, I'd discovered that the best revenge wasn't destroying your enemy. It was becoming someone they could never have imagined, someone who would spend their life making sure that what happened to you never happened to anyone else. The woman who'd been falsely accused of abuse was gone, but in her place stood someone who'd learned to fight back against injustice, someone who'd turned victim into victor, someone who'd transformed cruelty into compassion. That was my revenge, and it was more satisfying than any punishment could ever be.